5. Psychology. Let us examine briefly Freud's concept of man's psychology in the context of this anthropology. For Freud, quote, "In this psychical field, the biological factor is really the rock bottom," end quote, and by this he meant evolutionary and Lamarckian biology. The human personality consists for Freud of three major systems: the id, the ego, and the superego. Much of the misunderstanding of Freud comes from a failure to recognize these distinctions, which are seen as captious, novel, and utterly lacking in experimental evidence, being held to be mere inventions of Freud. This they may be, but if we translate Freud's terms into more familiar terminology, terms which he bypasses to avoid their non-scientific connotations, they become suddenly very clear. Freud took pains to spell out the meaning of the id in An Outline of Psychoanalysis, the Ego and the Id, and in the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. The id, the oldest aspect of man's personality, contains everything that is inherited, fixed in man's nature, present in birth, and instinctual, and it is beyond the laws of logic, especially beyond the law of contradiction. It is no negation, no concept of time or recognition of the passage of time, and it is without knowledge of values, morality, good or evil. It is simply instinctual cathexes, or sums of psychic energy seeking discharge. In itself, it is without conflicts. Everything in the id is unconscious and remains so. The id is fearless and totally amoral, and it, quote, obeys the inexorable pleasure principle, end quote. The id was a more specific concept than the unconscious, which included the repressed impulses, and it represented undifferentiated energy derived, quote, from the two primary life and death instincts, end quote. The id is the foundation of the personality. It is infantile, wants instant gratification, believes in its own omnipotence, is incapable of thought but wishes and acts. The id seeks pleasure, self-gratification, and the avoidance of pain. The id is the inner world of man before a single experience of the external world occurs. The id is unconscious and unorganized libido. The id, thus, despite very real differences, can be compared to what Christian theology speaks of as the first Adam, or old man, in man, or more specifically, as his original sin, that aspect of his being which makes him federally one with Adam, so that he is born into sin and is by nature a child of sin and death. For Freud, the life and death instincts are both present in the id. For Christian theology, sin, or the desire to be as God, who is the author and wellspring of life and totally creative, is basic to the old man, even as are the inevitable outworkings of death. The ego is the I of man, the organized aspect of the id, a psychical organization which mediates between the senses and his needs, and it is his urge to synthesis, to a unity of his conflicting impulses and the harsh reality of an external world which is not under the dominion of the id. The ego is governed by the reality principle. It is determined by the individual's own experiences. It must keep down the irrational demands of the id, for, being governed by the experiences of the man, the ego is aware of reality, whereas the id demands only its pleasure, total self-gratification. The ego is thus a transaction between the person and his world, so that the ego is moulded by the culture in a way impossible for the id. In a well-adjusted man, the ego governs both the id and the superego, and lives in harmony with the external world to the advantage of the total personality. Although the ego is culturally affected, its lines of development and adjustment are conditioned by heredity and by natural processes of growth. The ego, like the id, is capable of fantasy, but it has the ability to recognize that it is daydreaming. It does not confuse its pleasure-seeking hopes with reality. An important aspect of the ego, according to Freud, is this, quote, that the ego has no sexual currents, but only an interest in its own self-protection and in the preservation of its narcissism. The ego is not necessarily at war with the id. It can be seeking its fulfillment in terms of reality. As Freud stated it, quote, just as the pleasure ego can do nothing but wish, work towards gaining pleasure and avoiding pain, so that the reality ego need do nothing but strive for what is useful and guard itself against damage. Actually, this substitution of the reality principle for the pleasure principle denotes no dethronement of the pleasure principle, but only a safeguarding of it. A momentary pleasure, uncertain in its results, is given up, but only in order to gain in the new way an assured pleasure coming later. But the end psychic impression made by this substitution has been so powerful that it is mirrored in a special religious myth. The doctrine of reward in a future life for the voluntary or enforced renunciation of earthly lusts is nothing but a mythical projection of this revolution in the mind. End quote. Moreover, quote, neurosis is a result of a conflict between the ego and its id, whereas psychosis is the analogous outcome of a similar disturbance in the relation between the ego and its environment, outer world. End quote. Being governed by reality, the ego is compelled to exercise repression of certain demands of its own being. When the id makes a demand on the ego, the natural reaction of the ego is to gratify that instinctual demand. Cathexes, or physical energies in the id, almost like an electrical charge, want an outlet, and in terms of the reality principle, the ego seeks to gain an outlet for the cathexes. But the ego must also deal with anti-cathexes, a checking force of repression of the physical energies, or cathexes. There is a process which maintains the repression and ensures its continuance. Behind the process is the, quote, anti-cathexis, by means of which the system PCS, preconscious, guards itself against the intrusion of the unconscious idea, end quote. Why this repression? Quote, in the course of individual development, a part of the inhibiting forces in the outer world becomes internalized. A standard is created in the ego which opposes the other faculties by observation, criticism, and prohibition. We call this new process the superego, end quote. As a result, the ego, before it can satisfy the id, must, quote, consider not only the dangers of the outer world, but also the objections of the superego, end quote, so that repression is more prevalent than satisfaction. Quote, the superego is the successor and representative of the parents and educators who superintended the actions of the individual in his first years of life. It perpetuates their functions almost without a change. It keeps the ego in lasting dependence and exercises a steady pressure, end quote. As a result, the ego seeks to satisfy these authorities, now fully internalized, and to court their praise in its sacrifices to the superego. The superego can thus be an enemy of the id and a repressive force, but it can also unite with the id in condemning the ego as a vile and unworthy thing. These are the three systems that operate within man and make up his personality. It is by this time apparent that, despite the strangeness of their names, they are very familiar categories to Western thought. The id bears a marked resemblance to the old, fallen Adamic will of man, his inheritance as a member of the human race. The ego has a resemblance to the mind of man in the larger sense of the word, and the superego is even more clearly to be compared to the conscience. The resemblance is close enough to tempt one to read Freud in terms of traditional categories, especially as we recognize that Freud made the question of man's guilt basic to psychology. But when this is noted, it must then be added that Freud faced the guilt question openly and plainly, not in any even remotely religious sense, but in order to destroy ruthlessly the possibility of a religious concept of guilt by a biological, anthropological, non-moral and non-religious interpretation thereof. Thus, he faced the religious issue of guilt with a messianic faith in science's ability, if not to dissolve guilt, at least to reduce it to biology, and then to answer it with scientific understanding. Other psychologists have sought to ignore the religious implications of man's personality. Freud recognized them and sought to dissolve and destroy them. Not only was his approach to man and his guilt to be non-religious, but it was to be purged also of philosophy and to become strictly biological. Freud laboured under the illusion that science involved no pre-theoretical religious and philosophical presuppositions. Psychoanalysis could not serve any philosophy or philosophical outlook, for this would only be, quote, tyranny, even though disguised by the most honourable motives, end quote.